Good morning. This lecture video is going to go over human body orientation. So these are going to be the vocabulary words that we use to describe the body, regions of the body, how the body is divided internally, and then also throw in some different ways that we organize the body in terms of tissue layers or serous membranes. You can follow along in the diagram packet that goes along with this video to use to help you study for any kind of lab quiz. All right, so first we're going to start with the overall anatomical position. So whenever we talk about the human body, we are assuming that the body is in what we call the anatomical position, which is standing forward, or if you're lying down, lying upright, arms hanging by the side, palms forward, heads forward, and legs straight. So whenever we reference parts of the body, we are always just assuming that the body is in this position. It gives us a universal way to, a universal reference point. Next, we're going to go into terms of position and terms of direction. So we'll start with terms of directions. So the first two are going to be superior and inferior. So these are paired by opposites. So superior refers to structure being closer to the head or higher than another structure. So for instance, in a sentence, we would say the eyes are superior to the knees. Inferior refers to a structure being closer to the feet or the lower part of the body. So the waist is inferior to the neck. So superior really means above or higher than. Inferior means below or lower than. Anterior and posterior. Anterior refers to a structure being more in front of than another structure. So your knees are anterior to your heels. And then posterior means a structure being more in back or behind another structure. So your ears are posterior to the nose. So front and back, or in front of and behind. Medial lateral. Medial refers to a structure that is closer to the midline of the body, often called the median plane. And then lateral is going to refer to structures that are away from the midline of the body. So the heart is medial to the shoulder. It's closer to the midline than the shoulders are. And your ears are lateral to the nose. They are farther away from the midline than the nose is. So medial and lateral. Proximal and distal. Proximal refers to a structure being closer to the torso than another structure. So basically we're referring to the point of attachment to the body when referring to your limbs. So we only use these two words when talking about structures involved in your arms and legs. So that's a really important point. Only used when referring to your limbs. So it's going to be, proximal is going to be closer to the point where that limb would attach to the body or the trunk. So your elbow is proximal to the wrist. It's closer to where it would attach to the body than the wrist is. And then distal is going to be farther away from the point of attachment or farther away from the torso. So your fingers are distal to the shoulder. Your toes are distal to the knee. So closer or farther away from the point of attachment and only used with reference to limbs, arms and legs. Superficial and deep are two words you can add in to your packets. Hard to kind of diagram these, but superficial refers to being closer to the surface or closer to the skin. And then deep would be refer to a structure being farther inside the body, deeper. Next, we're going to look at planes and sections. So this is going to be how we section the body into areas. First, it's going to be the transverse plane. This will divide the body into upper and lower halves or parts. So dividing it into superior and inferior parts of the body. The sagittal plane will divide the body into left and right halves. If it's dividing the body directly down the middle into equal left and right halves, we would call it a mid-sagittal plane. However, you can divide the body or you can make a cut in a sagittal plane that's not smack in the middle, and so that would just be a sagittal plane. When we talk about like transverse, sagittal, these are different. Not only do they divide how we divide the body, but they're also going to be used to reference how we would take a tissue sample or cut a tissue sample. So if we cut it in a transverse, if we have a transverse sample, that means we cut it into, superior and inferior parts. If we have a sagittal cut, then we know that that organ or that tissue was cut, dividing it into left and right halves. So these are terms that are used oftentimes when taking tissue samples or when an incision is made. Frontal plane will divide the body into anterior and posterior halves, so front and back. And then the oblique plane, which you'll have to kind of write into your diagram, is going to be a plane that divides at any angle that's not a right angle, so going at a diagonal. So oftentimes we'll take tissue samples and we'll take an oblique sample or an oblique cut, and that means we're cutting in at an angle. So it's not straight horizontal or it's not straight vertical. Next, we'll look at the cavity and linings of the body. So your body is divided into two main cavities, the dorsal cavity and the ventral cavity. The dorsal cavity is going to contain your cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. The cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. So spinal cavity is also called the vertebral cavity. So dorsal is another word for posterior. So you can see it's in the posterior part of the body here. And then ventral is another word for anterior. So ventral is going to contain your thoracic cavity, which is up here, and then your abdominopelvic cavity, which is everything below the diaphragm. So your ventral cavity is going to be, the division point is going to be the diaphragm. Everything above that is thoracic. Everything below is abdominopelvic. And we can further divide the abdominopelvic cavity into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. So basically we have a front cavity, a back cavity, which is the dorsal. Cranial contains your brain. Spinal cavity is going to contain your spinal cord, your vertebral column. And then we have a front cavity, the ventral, which will contain your thoracic cavity. That will contain your lungs, your heart. And then the abdominal cavity, which will contain your digestive organs. And then the pelvic cavity, which will contain reproductive organs. Your ventral cavity, looking at that a little bit more closely. So again, this is that anterior cavity. It is further divided into the thoracic cavity, which includes the mediastinum. And then also is going to include the pleural cavities, which hold the lungs. So the mediastinum is going to be the cavity that really holds, it's this middle area here that's going to hold your heart, and then the membrane surrounding your heart, and then this upper section here, and then the pleural cavity, which will contain your lungs. Your abdominopelvic cavity, again, is going to be the abdominal region, and then the pelvic cavity. This will be where most of your digestive organs are. Your pelvic cavity will be where your reproductive organs are and or some of your urinary structures. All right, inside your body, the cavities are going to be lined in a series of membranes or tissues. So membranes is kind of a fancy word for skin, so I think it's easiest to think of it in terms of skin. But you have this double-layered membrane system that surrounds the organs that are found in the ventral cavity. So they're going to surround the heart, they're going to surround the lungs, and then they're going to surround the digestive organs. This system is made up of two layers of tissue or skin. So there is a parietal layer or a parietal membrane. This is actually going to line the cavity that is holding the organs. So these are the outside membranes. Then there's going to be this little space. You can see that right here. This space that's going to contain serous fluid. So this is called the serous cavity, and inside is serous fluid. And then there's another membrane or skin or tissue layer that's going to directly touch the organ, and this is called the visceral membrane. So there are these three structures. The functions of the serous membranes is to help lubricate the organs and to help protect them and to reduce friction. So when we breathe, we don't want to have, you can see these little black dots are representing the ribs. We don't want to have these ribs rubbing directly up against our lungs, right? That friction isn't good. So these membranes that surround the lungs, the heart, and the abdominal organs, they help reduce the friction of those organs rubbing up against other structures. They kind of help lubricate them with that serous fluid that's in that cavity. And then it serves as a way to protect those particular organs. So the lungs will be surrounded by 3 of these structures: the parietal membrane, the serous cavity, and the visceral membrane. The heart will also be surrounded by these 3, and then the abdominal organs will be surrounded by these 3. Depending on if it's covering, these membranes are covering the lungs, the heart, or the digestive organs, determines what the word is that we would use with the parietal and the visceral. So if we start with the lungs, the serous membranes surrounding the lungs, whoops, we're going to skip that slide, are called the pleura. So the parietal pleura is going to line the ventral cavity. Then there's this pleural cavity, which has the serous fluid in it. And then in green here is the visceral pleura, which is going to directly touch the lungs. So when you see the word pleura, we're talking about the membranes that surround the lungs. Visceral is always going to be the deepest membrane. So if you've ever heard someone say they have a visceral response to something, they're referring to having a very deep response to something. So visceral means deep. So one way to remember. If we're talking about the structures around the heart, we're talking about the pericardium. So again, we have the parietal pericardium, which is going to be this layer on the outside. Then you have the pericardial cavity, which is this cavity here with the serous fluid. And then on the inside, you have the visceral pericardium, which will directly touch the heart. So this is kind of showing you a cool picture of how this actually works. So these membranes are kind of all connected to each other. So here would again be the outer membrane, so the parietal membrane. Here's the cavity holding the serous fluid, so assuming this is like a water balloon. And then this in here would be the visceral membrane. And in the abdominal cavity, we would have the parietal peritoneum, which is going to be located on the outside, the peritoneal cavity, which is going to hold all of these different organs, and then lining each specific organ here would be the visceral peritoneum. So peritoneum refers to the abdominal organs. So pleural for lungs, pericardium for heart, and peritoneum for digestive organs. I'm not sure why that is upside down up there, but I'm just going to go with it. All right, we also divide the abdominal into quadrants. So you basically dividing it by 4. You have a right upper quadrant, a left upper quadrant, a right lower quadrant, and a left lower quadrant. And remember, be very careful, because when we are labeling these, we label them as if they are in the anatomical position. So when this is the right upper quadrant, even though when you're looking at it right now, it's on the left side, but on the person, it's on the right side. So that's something that you need to be very careful of when you're looking at these different structures, is we label them based on where they are on the human being in the anatomical position. These are important, these quadrants, and these quadrants are also further divided into subquadrants because it helps give an idea of where a problem could be. So for instance, if a patient comes in with pain in the left upper quadrant, well, we can eliminate something like appendicitis because that would be in the right lower quadrant. So by labeling these quadrants and listening to where a patient may be having issues, we can kind of eliminate organs that wouldn't be involved and kind of focus on organs that would be found in those specific quadrants. All right, last is looking at regions of the body. So these are going to be various regions that we give specific names to. Some of them will make sense, some of them will be new to you. But when we talk about the eye socket, we call that the orbital region. When we talk about the mouth, we call that the oral region. And most of these regions are also further divided into other smaller subregions. When we talk about the chin, we call it the mental region. The thoracic region refers to the anterior chest. Cubital region refers to that armpit or your elbow pit, that crevice in your elbow, like when you fold your arm up. So this is where blood would be taken oftentimes. Sometimes it's referred to as the antecubital region as well. The abdominal region is going to be basically above your belly button, below your chest. The umbilical region is your belly button. The pubic region would be below the belly button then. The inguinal region refers to your groin, or kind of that area where your legs are going to attach to the torso of your body. The patellar region is the knee, anterior knee. Occipital region is the back of your head, lower back of your head. Scapular region refers to your shoulder blade. Vertebral region refers to along the spinal cord or along your backbone. The lumbar region is lower back. Sacral region is your tailbone. The gluteal region refers to your buttocks. Popliteal region refers to the back of the knee. Cervical region typically refers to your neck. This one you have to be careful about because cervical can also refer to the cervix in the female reproductive system, but generally in terms of body position, it just refers to the neck. Axillary refers to your armpit. So you can take a body temperature, an axillary body temperature. Acromial refers to your shoulders, also called the deltoid region. Brachial refers to your upper arm. Femoral refers to your upper leg, your thigh. Plantar refers to the sole of your foot, the soles of your feet. So those are some of the vocabulary that we use to describe the human body.